Welcome, first of all. I'm Gabriele Boccaccini, the director of the Enoch Seminar, and I would like to welcome all people that have joined our webinar and are listening to us or will listen to us on Facebook and then on YouTube. This is a meeting in our series Meet the Author. It's a quite informal setting in which we take advantage of the work of some friends and members of the Enoch Seminar to discuss some important topics in Second Temple Judaism and Christian origins. Today we are very pleased to have with us Professor James McGrath. Jim, our friend, is a professor of New Testament language and literature at Butler University, and is the author, well-known author of several books on the New Testament, including now this one on John the Baptist. With us, you see on screen also three friends from the two sides of the Atlantic, Federico Adinolfi from Italy, and then David Barnett and Lynn Parr, that will join our conversation about John the Baptist. All the people that are participating in the webinar are invited to express their comments at any time, their comments or questions after 30 minutes in which I will have a conversation with Jim. We will listen to what our panelists have to say, and then the floor will be open for a general discussion. We have 2 hours, so we have plenty of time for discussing John the Baptist. Jim, as you remember, and the others too, 4 years ago, we had a very nice conference on John the Baptist in the middle of a pandemic. Was very well attended, very interesting conference, online conference on John the Baptist. And if you remember, Jim, we started the conference asking some of the participants to present their view of John the Baptist. So who is John the Baptist for you? And so I'm asking you the same question, just to start our conversation. If you should tell us just in 5 minutes, who is John the Baptist for you, it will be very interesting to know your answer.
Yes, thank you, Gabriele. And I just love the Enoch Seminar so much. Particularly, I've heard people say that they've been to online conferences and they weren't as good as in person. But the Enoch Seminar's conferences, shifting online during the pandemic, were just so meaningful, just such rich and rewarding engagement. I hope today's will be as well. So I think the shortest answer I could give to how do I think about John the Baptist is that I think he was a lot more like Jesus than most people imagine. I think that would be maybe the quickest route to get to a mental picture. According to several of our New Testament sources, there was much more continuity than discontinuity between Jesus and John. Often you'll hear contrast made that John was a prophet of doom and gloom and Jesus was more about love. John was fasting, Jesus was feasting, and things like that. And of course, Jesus' teaching on fasting was not, don't fast, but don't let people see it. So clearly Jesus was an innovator, but he was an innovator on a foundation laid by John. Through baptism, Jesus joined John's movement, and that movement definitely had an apocalyptic sort of outlook, focused on the imminent arrival of the kingdom of God, but was also clearly very socially engaged, both in terms of what we see attributed to him by way of teaching about socioeconomic justice and matters of that sort, but also in terms of the ramifications of his baptism for forgiveness of sins, for the temple, its authorities, its financial stability, and other things, and the attention that he got from Herod Antipas. And so the short answer that I would give is that with maybe some minor differences in eating favorite foods or some other points of possible difference between him and Jesus, that in fact if you've got a well-informed historical view of Jesus, that imagining John the Baptist as very much like that will probably be appropriate. Obviously, if you've got a very anachronistic, modernized sort of Jesus, then imagining John as being like him won't help very much.
Yes, I think that this new focus of interest on John the Baptist is one of the major accomplishments of research on New Testament and Second Temple Judaism. I mean, the more we study John, the more we understand the importance of the character and also the continuity between the teaching of John the Baptist and Jesus. I would like now to challenge you on some interesting points that you make in your reconstruction of the biography of John the Baptist. We know that it's almost impossible now to write based on our sources a complete biography. Okay, but you indicate some important points. So the first point is your insistence that baptism was understood by John as a sort of substitute or replacement of sacrifices in the temple. And I would like you to tell us something more about this. And in particular, why was for John necessary to find an alternative way for forgiveness of sins?
Yeah, so I mean, the what is itself controversial. So I'll start with that. Not for everyone, but certainly some viewed John's baptism as being primarily or exclusively about purity. And so do want to emphasize that two things really persuade me that for John, his baptism was a baptism for the forgiveness of sins. It was something different than other forms of immersion in that time. One is the indication we get in our sources that his authority to baptize was challenged. And of course, you don't need any particular authority to do a purity immersion. The fact that he gets remembered and known as the immerser in a time when people were immersing for purity and bathing reasons so widely. And so I think that was the significance of John's baptism. Exactly how he understood it, was it repeatable? There are lots of things that are maybe less certain, but that was its significance. Seems to me to be very much supported by the evidence. As to why and how John got there, I've really been increasingly persuaded that the influence of the book of Isaiah on him, that is hinted at through quotations from the latter part of that book, also provides important evidence. I could imagine him, taking one scroll, going out into the wilderness, trying to figure out what he's supposed to do, and find his calling, and not getting past that, that very beginning, where you have this prophetic denunciation of sacrifice, not because it is genuinely anti-sacrifice in the sense of trying to abolish the institution per se, but saying that people are sacrificing but not doing what is right. And then there's this call to the people to wash themselves clean, and using water imagery. And so I think that one of the reasons why John may have been motivated, and I think there are multiple ones, and I do try to engage in some speculative connecting of dots about his family background, how that might have influenced him. But I think on the practical level, just calling people to repent without some sort of ritual, some sort of action that sort of cemented it and made it more sacred, right, would have been less effective. And I think that calling the people to get together and on Yom Kippur yet again and go through some ritual that they were used to practicing, and making that the focus of this movement of repentance and of trying to change the society, would have been less effective. I think that John probably, whether consciously or subconsciously, would have been aware that the imagery of finally washing yourselves, making yourselves clean, doing what is right that we find in Isaiah, that actually acting that out would lend some power to his repetition, otherwise, as it might be perceived, of this long-standing prophetic message.
Do you think that John claimed to have the authority to forgive sins? Because a priest does not claim to have the authority to forgive sins. Even though sacrifices are for forgiveness of sins, a priest does not have the authority to forgive sins. Not probably because God only has the power to forgive sins. The sacrifice is offered so that God will forgive sins. So what is the attitude? Because what is in your view the attitude of John the Baptist? Because the Christians later on, after the death of Jesus, they will claim that Jesus, as the Messiah, as the Son of Man, had the authority to forgive sins. Not like a priest, because it's an authority that is given by God to the person himself. What do you think was the attitude of John the Baptist, and the attitude also of the historical Jesus?
Yeah, and I think the two need to be connected there. Matthew certainly understood those words attributed to Jesus to mean that God has given this to one or more human beings, given this authority, and so I'm pretty sure that Jesus would have included John the Baptist as one of those people who has been given that authority. It's maybe the most interesting question, and one that I didn't feel like I could give any sort of definitive answer to, but I consider noteworthy just by how infrequently it's asked, is if there's a historical basis for a paralyzed man being brought to Jesus and for him to have said something about the man's sins being forgiven. I want to know whether there was a baptism of any sort, because I think that's the really interesting question about that story. On the one hand, there's water, not too far away from just about any place in Capernaum. On the other hand, this man has mobility issues. And so if we envisage Jesus, sprinkling, is he just pronouncing? I think that if we had some more answers about this story, if we knew for sure whether we should assume that some sort of baptism is involved because Jesus is involved in this movement that John started that connects baptism and forgiveness, and his movement after him also connects the two, then should we just assume that there would have been something on that occasion? I'm certainly open to the possibility that Jesus would have perhaps made some adaptations to John's practice of baptizing in places where there was plenty of flowing water, living water in Aramaic. I'm not sure that John would have disagreed with that adaptation, right? I think that John being concerned about giving access as well as bringing repentance to the socially and economically marginalized, that he probably would have had no disagreements about extending that to people with limited mobility who might find getting to a place and being immersed in water cumbersome, if not impossible. And it's interesting that we have another story that shows up in the Gospel of John about Jesus talking about forgiveness in connection with him being by an immersion pool and things of that sort. And so it seems to me that whatever we want to say about John's authority to forgive sins, it should once again match up with what we say about Jesus and his authority to forgive sins.
You present John as a son of a priest, but also as a rebellious son to a certain extent, that is trying to indicate an alternative way for forgiveness of sin. And I repeat just the question: why? Why you think that John had such an interest in offering, of presenting himself. What is the urgency of this? I don't think we can say also, okay, baptism is more convenient than going to Jerusalem. I don't think that this is, I don't know. I mean, maybe you could expect this motivation more in the diaspora, but after all, Galilee is not so far away. In any case, why do you think that John the Baptist really had this idea that to offer an alternative way? What was the urgency? Why is forgiveness of sins was so important?
Yeah, so I think there are two aspects to it. One is I think that his keen awareness that we get, in just the few words attributed to him in our various sources of issues of social and economic inequity. I'm pretty sure that John would have recognized that applies to access to sacred space and to the means of atonement in the temple. That those who lived further afield, right, did not have the luxury of sinning the way that somebody who lived close to the temple did, to put it that way. And of course, John would have agreed with all those prophets before him that that's not how one should think of sacrifice, but it's still in practice. One has access or lack of access depending on where one lives. And I suspect that whether I'm right or not about the possibility that there was a lifelong Nazarite dedication, right? Certainly the church commentators on the Gospel of Luke are pretty consistent about that, and that seems to be how it was understood. Rabbinic tradition said, you swear off alcohol, which is what happened in the case of John, and that's considered to have made a Nazarite vow. But even apart from that, I think that we can see this broader concern for equity and also an awareness of the fact that in Scripture, the creation of a temple is viewed much more ambiguously than the mainstream tradition that focused on and supported the temple tended to highlight. It's like the question that the early Christians not long after are continuing to raise is raised when this idea is proposed, right? Will God dwell in a house made with human hands? And so this view of the temple as something that had become an idol, right? Even if it is supposed to safeguard and embody the presence of the one God of Israel, nonetheless, it becomes an idol. And so I think he's aware of that, right? And he's aware of the prophetic tradition that people believing that God's presence with them will protect them, have regularly said, God is on our side, instead of doing what John and so many prophets before him had emphasized, which is to say we have to get on God's side, right? That the reason why promises are not being fulfilled, the reason why we're not seeing the kingdom dawn, is not because God is late or is unwilling, but because we have not conformed ourselves to the justice, have not conformed our lives to the justice that God demands.
Tim, I would like to ask you something more about how much important, in your view, is the apocalyptic and also messianic dimension? Because I mean, for many of us, this is a central aspect in John the Baptist. The announcement of the imminent coming of the kingdom of God, the announcement of God's judgment, the fight against evil. So, to a certain extent, forgiveness of sins is also the urgency of forgiveness of sins is directly related to this urgency. I mean, the time that is coming, etc., etc. I'm reading your book. I mean, I got the impression sometimes that you are a little bit downplaying this apocalyptic aspect. I mean, for instance, all your discussion about the one that is coming, someone that is coming, you say, okay, it's not the Messiah, it's not God, it's not the last judgment. John is referring to literally to one of his disciples that, like in the mood of, of Elijah, no, that after him another disciple will come after him. And I was curious just to know something more about, okay, we are in the Enoch seminar, okay? How important for you are the apocalyptic aspect, not only in terms of eschatology, but also in terms of protology, for understanding the figure of John the Baptist?
Yeah, I think there too, I probably have not only risked being misunderstood, but have fallen into the trap that I set for myself. But in trying to get readers away from this view of John as this, this gruff person who just talks about, the end is nigh and has no message of hope, has no positive vision. I may have shifted the balance in some of the things that I said in the other direction in a way that doesn't actually reflect my viewpoint. I would once again say that I think that both John and Jesus are, to an equal extent, apocalyptic figures. I'm not persuaded that just because someone thinks that, a decisive moment has arrived, that, the nation is going to be held accountable, that necessarily means, as sometimes one almost gets the impression people think about John, that there's an eagerness, right, to see God's judgment fall on people. John seems to have genuinely wanted to see the people change. Right? I think his message was, the time is not just at hand, but is overdue. Right? Based on calculations, whether you're doing Daniel's weeks or anything else, the things that were expected should have happened, and they haven't because we have not been ready. And so I'm here to give you one last chance, essentially. And so I do think he believed he was living at that sort of decisive moment. I think that prophets who understood themselves to be forerunners to whether it was historical judgment or a complete end of history, nonetheless, were not always, therefore, uninterested in things like what we might call social reform and social change and things like that. Certainly, we see, whether among the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see in Enochic literature, we see literature that comes from people who have this sense of eschatological apocalyptic urgency, and yet also are concerned with making a difference and calling people to change the way that they are doing things. And so I was trying to make more room for the things that are neglected, and in the process may have come across as downplaying the apocalyptic character of John.
Finally, before opening the floor to discussion to our respondent, I would like to ask you also some further clarification about the relation between Jesus and John. I see more and more authors, and I think there is an agreement on this, to connect more closely Jesus and John, in the sense that Jesus should be understood, first of all, as one of the disciples of John, that the group of the first followers of Jesus were also previously followers of John the Baptist. That there is also some overlapping between the preaching of John the Baptist, the ministry of John the Baptist, and the ministry of Jesus, instead of being a sort of separate times, first John, then. So I see many of us that are stressing that there was a certain kind of overlapping, that Jesus spent time with John the Baptist, and also the beginning of his ministry was essentially in line with the teaching of John the Baptist, or in continuation with the teaching of John the Baptist. You seem to go even further on in claiming that even some events of some deeds of Jesus were not only connected with or inspired by John the Baptist, but directly um, inspired, like Jesus, almost like a proxy of John the Baptist, especially in the cleansing of the temple. I know that this would be a very controversial point, but I would like you to clarify a little bit your view about this overlapping between Jesus and John.
Yeah, so of late, I get asked a lot about my views on the historicity of John's gospel. I think I've been fairly consistent, because I started out working on Gospel of John, and it has a very distinctive style, and all of the characters' words sound basically the same and have a lot of the same characteristics, and so we're definitely getting an author's very distinctive take on what happened. But it does seem that there are in John a wealth of historical details that are just included almost as backdrop for some of this distinctive storytelling and distinctive narration, distinctive discourse at length with the above and below and the light and the darkness and all these things consistently woven in throughout. And one of those is the cleansing of the temple. And even before I had this book project on my radar, I contributed an essay on this subject to the one of the John, Jesus, and History volumes, and some of the language of Jesus' temple saying that's attributed to him, even shows up in Paul, right? About destroying God's, the one who destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, and we have a tent awaiting us. If we put off this earthly tent, we have one not made with human hands, and so all these echoes of the tradition that we get both in John and the Synoptics is already there in Paul, and so that there was some saying of this sort attributed to Jesus seems to be very likely, and the action in the temple seems to be connected with it according to John. But we probably could have deduced that from the Synoptics as well, putting that plus the trial accusations together. And one of those details that the Gospel of John includes that's really striking is the 46 years of construction of the temple, right? Which would put us right around 26, the year 26 CE, which is 3 years or more, depending on one's view of the date of the crucifixion, but a good 3 years before the crucifixion, which is the time frame of the Gospel of John as well. And it's really striking that it lines up like that, right? There was no reason for the author to throw in that detail, to invent that detail. And it seems unlikely that somebody who had no tradition of storytelling going back to something that was said that somebody had actually done the math would work that in order to provide that impression of when this is happening. When we take that together with the fact that in John's own narrative, John the Baptist has still not been put in prison. He is still active publicly. I think that it makes sense to understand Jesus to have been acting at John's behest. Right? And I think one other interesting question that doesn't get asked often enough is, would John have had apostles, right, representatives? There's been a lot of discussion about whether John himself had to be actively involved in baptism, or whether one could one baptize oneself. Could other people sent out as emissaries of John's movement baptize if it had to be something that was done actively? And is it possible that Jesus was a key figure of that sort during John's movement? I think questions like that are if all I've done is raise some of these questions that have tended to be neglected, even if the consensus of scholars is that they should be answered differently than I have, I'll be happy. I think that there's a key question there, right? And so I don't want to give the impression that John's gospel is just blanket historical, more historical than the Synoptics, historical in the this, that, or the other way. I think that it is not useless to historians, that it contains things that historians should take seriously, that just because it's so different, it should not be dismissed, because a lot of the times the differences are not 3 against 1 of the Synoptics, but 1, Mark and his structure and chronology, versus John, and then 2 others that make it into the New Testament following Mark's layout of things.
Thanks. The least we can say of your book, you have been very bold in connecting the dots, okay? Because covering all aspects of these very complex figures. I mean, the problem of baptism, from forgiveness of sins, the eschatology, the relation with Jesus, etc. So now I'm curious to know what the reaction of our respondents is, and then we will have more time for discussion, also to address some of the questions that I see are already coming from the chat. So I will start in alphabetical order. I mean, if you don't mind, I mean, Federico Adinolfi is the author also on a book on John the Baptist that has many things in common with what you just said, Jim. Also some significant differences. So this will certainly help our discussion today.
Okay, thank you, Gabriele. Well, first of all, I should apologize, as I realized just last night that I had read the wrong book. I mean, I read James' other book, the big book and more scholarly, John of History, Baptist of Faith. However, this should not be too much of a problem, since the points I will focus on are also paramount, of course, in The Christmaker. So I would like to start by stating straight away what I consider to be the major contribution of James' work in both books. That is, having convincingly showed that the continuity between John and Jesus was so deep and extensive that Jesus must be considered the successor of John. To quote James, "The evidence suggests that continuity is the predominant relationship. The presumption should be continuity unless the evidence clearly indicates otherwise." James has detected John's influence on Jesus at so many levels: the apocalyptic expectation of the kingdom of God, attitude towards the temple, idiomatic Aramaic Son of Man sayings mean someone, one, or used in an emphatic state, so perhaps the one, as picking up John's prophetic talk of the one who is coming. Then also warning talk about vipers and trees in danger, baptizing and healing activity, Torah, ethics, social justice, and so on. I think James is also completely right to stress that from a methodological point of view, what we know of the historical Jesus is a lens that can help us bring in John into sharper focus. Exactly 10 years ago, I felt I was almost preaching in the desert when I defended my doctoral thesis entitled "Jesus as Continuer of John," in which I argued that in every respect, Jesus' activity and message were completely consistent with John's. And although some aspect may well be more typical of Jesus than it appears to have been the case of John, for instance, Jesus' exorcisms or his commensality with sinners, even in these instances, Jesus remained within the boundaries of John's ministries. So on this topic, my endorsement of James' work could not be more enthusiastic. I am only sorry that James did not interact with the article that Joanne Taylor and I published in 2012 on the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, where we show how Mark's narrative is full of traces of a baptismal activity by Jesus in the Lake of Galilee, as it would have given further strength to some of James' theses, for instance, regarding the Baptist origin matrix of the expression fishers of people, or the close link between immersions and exorcisms. And now I come to my point of disagreement with James. The main problem, in my view, is how he understands John's immersion as being an alternative means of obtaining forgiveness that intentionally competed with the temple and the sacrificial system. According to James, John made up his baptism as an alternative to sacrifices driven by a twofold reason. Firstly, a biographical reason. Practicing a rite that ensured the forgiveness of sins allowed John to remain somewhat faithful to his priestly identity, which he had renounced by giving priority to the Nazirite vow that his mother Elizabeth secretly made on behalf of him. So, forced to choose between the two incompatible callings his parents wanted for him, to be a priest or to be a lifelong Nazirite, John chose the latter, while trying nonetheless to include something of the former. I will not dwell on this point too much, since I consider this part of James' reconstruction a brilliant exercise in historical imagination, like a kind of fiction inspired by certain elements of Luke's infancy narrative that many would regard as much too legendary to be historically reliable. From my point of view, the case of John being a Nazir is weaker and less clearly supported by the sources than the fact of his priestly identity. And since priests were required to sacrifice in the temple only few days a year, the whole question of what caused John to break his father's heart by deserting the priestly office is simply a false problem. Nowhere is John criticized for abdicating his priestly role. Therefore, we could rather make up a different fiction in which John went indeed to the temple to sacrifice on the few days when it was the turn of his own priestly division. The second reason that would have motivated the invention of baptism is more in keeping with what we actually know of John, namely a deep social concern for the economic difficulties of ordinary people. According to James, John was convinced that the centralized sacrificial system burdened poor people too much. Animal sacrifices were expensive, not to mention the cost of getting to Jerusalem for those who had to come from afar. Therefore, I quote, John sought to provide freer access to forgiveness by eliminating the expense of animal sacrifice, and offered a means of atonement everywhere water was available. It can be doubted, however, that the sacrificial system was perceived by the people as excessively onerous and oppressive. Ancient sources attest that loyalty and devotion to the temple were widespread sentiments deeply rooted among the Jews of the time. Pilgrimages on major festivals were moments of great joy and celebration for Jewish families. So, are we really sure that a prophet who sought to convince the people that it was no longer necessary to travel to Jerusalem and to sacrifice as Moses required would have been as welcomed as the sources indicate that John indeed was? In my opinion, a large-scale call for boycott of the temple cult, offering a new ritual alternative to sacrifices, would have caused sensation and a scandal of enormous proportions, since it would have affected the two fundamental pillars of Jewish piety, the temple and the Torah. But our oldest and best sources bear no trace of either John or Jesus being criticized for abolishing sacrifices. And here I come to a fundamental point. In my opinion, an anti-temple, anti-sacrifices John is not really supported by the sources that should help us triangulate him according to James' method, except in the case of the later sources, such as the Gospel of John, the Gospel of the Ebionites, and the writings of the Mandeans. But let us dwell instead on the earliest point of triangulation, Jesus as John's disciple. Jesus is remembered in the synoptic tradition for commanding the leper he healed to present the sacrificial offering prescribed by Moses for his cleansing, for imparting a teaching on the correct way to offer sacrifices at the altar, for defending the sanctity of the temple and the altar in his critique of the oaths practiced by the Pharisees. Jesus is remembered for conceding that the Pharisees were after all right to pay tithes on mint, dill, and cumin, by which he shows he agreed that people should pay tithes to the temple and the priest, something which affected, of course, the economic lives of the ordinary people. Similarly, Jesus is remembered as praising a poor widow who had donated everything she had to the temple, implying that donation to the temples were a noble and pious work, not a foolish waste of money, provided that they are motivated by love and devotion. According to Mark, Jesus also took care to organize the Passover supper to be eaten with his disciples, which naturally would have involved the sacrifice of a lamb. Not to mention how central the temple is in the infancy narratives on both Jesus and John, and how the priest Josephus presents John as an exemplary model of piety. In short, devotion to the temple and acceptance of the sacrificial systems are attested or at least implied in all the best sources we have on Jesus and John. So, how is it possible that such a large-scale boycott of the temple and the sacrifices by John and Jesus left almost no traces in the sources? For instance, if the saying source Q, as James convincingly argues, was a collection of Jesus' teaching designed to present him as John's faithful successor, and I believe that this is a seminal contribution to Q research, should we not find in Q some trace of cultic critique of the temple and sacrifices? But there is none. So, in my opinion, the anti-temple and anti-sacrifice reading of the Baptist and Jesus is untenable. Rather, the baptism practiced by John and Jesus should be seen as complementary to sacrifices and functional to worship in the temple. After all, John and Jesus directed their attentions precisely to people like tax collectors and unrepentant sinners who were most likely to ignore the commandments related to the temple, or even worse, to enter the temple without having repented of their sins and amended their ways, which in John's and Jesus' eyes would imply they were still in a state of ritual impurity. No matter if they had previously immersed themselves in the Jerusalem mikvaot or any other sources of water, they would still have profaned the sanctity of the temple unless they first returned to righteousness so that God could grant his forgiveness and purify their souls. See Josephus and also the community rule. So I would think that both John and Jesus deeply cared for the holiness of the temple. And while both may well have their critical reservations about its current management by the priestly aristocracy or the architectural changes made by Herod, it is highly unlikely that they themselves could have promoted a ritual that would have exacerbated the temple crisis rather than fix it. In this light, I would have
we lost the signal.
At least if we follow.
Okay. Federico, we lost the signal, but I think that we got the point very well, no, about the problem that of the relationship between the teaching of John the Baptist and the temple and the temple system, and this is true also this is also true for in the case of Jesus, and I guess that Jim will have a lot of things to say in reply. But I will move to the next panelist. I mean, I see, I see Federico. And at the end, I will give you, Jim, the opportunity to respond. So let's go to Lynn now for an equally interesting response now. Federico, have you...
I was almost finished.
Okay, because we lost your connection.
Okay, so I just 1 minute. So Jesus' action in the temple should be seen as a passionate defense of the sanctuary. At least we follow Adela Yarber Collins' reading of it, according to which Jesus' action was motivated by concern for the holiness of the whole temple area, which was not to be contaminated by profane activities and objects, such as the sale of animals, Tyrian coins with the image of a pagan god, or the transport through the temple of ordinary profane vessels. But in spite of this major point of criticism, let me conclude by stating again that we must be very grateful to James for having given us so many stimulating insights that will certainly lead us towards a better understanding of John the Baptist, Jesus, the source Q, the Son of Man problem, and many other matters as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this clear analysis. Lynn, it's your turn now.
Okay, hello everyone, and first of all, thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation. I really enjoyed Christmaker a lot. I too have had a lot of questions about John the Baptist as I've studied the New Testament and especially the figure of Jesus. So I really appreciate your work here. I wanted just to focus my comments on two chapters that I really fell into and found myself really drawn to. The chapters are the second and third chapters. They deal with the intersecting themes of the temple and forgiveness, baptism, the networks of influence and support for John's movement. I think these in some ways form a core of what you're going to do in the rest of the book. And I wanted just to draw out some points and present some questions and moments of pause I have on some of those areas. So in chapter 2, which is titled, "I Will Destroy This Temple," I appreciate the distinction you make between John's baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins and the ablutions to remove ritual defilement. In my teaching or in any interactions I do with a larger public audience, there's a lot of confusion about the differences there. So I really appreciated your discussion there and making that really strong distinction. And it really helps to highlight the religious innovation that John the Baptist put forward. This section leads to the discussion of the temple sacrifice for forgiveness of sins and your argument that John challenged the ultimacy of the temple. I too, with Federico, have some hesitation about the very strong claim with that. It also just now brought to mind the book by Thiessen, Jesus and the Forces of Death, and the ways in which he makes an argument about a complementary practice with Jesus's healings. So that book came to mind as I would probably support more of a complementary practice and trying to remove barriers for people. So I just wanted to note that. I did really appreciate your assertion of John putting himself in being motivated by his strong feelings. You don't often hear discussions about, the feelings and the emotion behind these figures. I mean, it's hard to get in someone's head, no matter what. But the idea that in the prophetic tradition, that feeling of being motivated for that passion for justice and the desire for a radical reform, I think the way you described it in that section was very powerful. In presenting the alternative to animal sacrifice in the temple, John presents a threat to the temple. I think you make this a good case for this and how that connects him to Jesus's famous, action in the temple. I'm convinced by your argument that Jesus acted out John's message in that scene. I thought that was really, to say that he was acting on John's behest, I thought was very compelling. But I got kind of stuck here on the argument about this means that, or this is another way of explaining John's disassociation from the Essenes and from Qumran. So it seemed to me that the critique of the temple might be evidence, it might seem to connect John to the Essenes, rather than that you're saying that this action is separating him from them. And I understood what you said about they have different desires. You know, the Essenes were looking to replace the temple authorities, and John is looking to kind of do away with the importance of the temple or something. And that didn't quite sit right with me. So I'm interested, maybe I just kind of lost the thread somewhere, but maybe you can tell me a little bit more to help me understand why you take such a strong claim to disassociate John from the Essenes. Water as a symbol of purity, liberation, and judgment, combined with the imagery of the wilderness and the Exodus narrative, made John's preaching about baptism especially potent and represents John's creativity. As in the traditions about Jesus, the traditions about John in the Gospels point to an array of scriptural references and interpretive keys, especially in his practice of immersion. In John's case, the common practice of immersion in water becomes an inward decision that is made public, and this further enables moral reform with a new way of holding people accountable. You imagine additional ritual elements based on the Mandean sources and making it a transformative spiritual experience available to all. I think the way you described this was really effective, especially for a popular audience, and to see the ways in which there are multiple scriptural references that are being integrated, and also symbolic elements that are going into what John is doing as a creative religious act. That was very compelling and interesting. So on that score, I want to commend the use of critical imagination in reconstructing John's life. I think the earlier chapters on John's family dynamics seem like a bit of a stretch. I wasn't totally with you on all of that. But especially the gender dynamics seemed a little bit forced to me. But your imaginings of the ritualistic elements of John's immersion practice are really helpful for the rich visual reference that they provide. On this point, you state that the practice was linked to healing, as in the Jesus tradition of Jesus forgiving sins and associating that with healing, and also linking this with Mandean traditions that link baptism and exorcism. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about this. In your comments earlier with Gabriele, you said that you too are interested in that connection a little bit more. So I think that's an area where there could be another place for your critical imagination. And especially given the precarity of health in this historical period, I'd really like to see you explore that a bit more. So chapter 3, with the lost sheep of Israel, a striking moment in this chapter is the claim that John asserted that it is not enough to rely on ancestry and not to be held accountable for wrongdoing. That's later developed in Romans, especially by Paul. And the line from John to Jesus to Paul was really interesting to me. And you made the argument very clearly. Your argument about the subgroups of a tradition locked in debates about who is most righteous is as timely now as ever, and enlarges the scope for the implications of the argument that you're making. To say that Paul too is an inheritor of John's thought was a new insight for me. I would not have put John, not really, only in the most vague way. So I really appreciated that connection, and that Paul expands on John's thought in terms of gender equity, and that you acknowledge the contributions of women to John's movement. I thought that was another area that really piqued my interest, and wanted to hear more about that. And it gives further evidence for why taking our eyes off of Jesus for a while and looking at other figures can be really productive. So this chapter demonstrates John's empathy to those he called to repentance by emphasizing that he did not ask prostitutes or tax collectors to leave their livelihood, but he asks them to consider their own actions and choices. You imagine that John saw injustices on the level of systems. He himself left everything and went to the wilderness. He wore a camel cloth as a sign of his repentance. He relied on those who had no opportunity to keep their hands clean for the reception of his ideas, in contrast to those who claim righteousness at the expense of others. I appreciate all these points, but I worry a little bit about taking John a little too far out of his social context. And some of the language here seemed what we would use as sort of modern social justice discussions. So I like the move of linking John to present day analogs, but I think the turns of phrase strike me as a little bit off. I'm not sure how to fix that, other than to say more about the social context of John and be a little more self-conscious about your own social location and your historical distance and our modern readers' historical distance from the figures that we're talking about. I loved the section on the way. Again, did not associate this term with John until this book. And the connection you make between Isaiah 40 and John's movement, the idea of making a straight path for God by straightening their own paths in preparation for God's arrival, is very compelling and fits with John's apocalyptic content. Which, as with others, I don't think you dealt with the apocalyptic content, that as strongly as I expected you to. And that leads me back to, I'm remembering that I made a note about the idea with the temple sacrifice being replaced and the urgency about that. I would have, like others have noted, I would have put that into the eschatological urgency, and the temporality that accompanies a lot of the apocalyptic content. So there's a lot more I could say. The last thing I want to note is in the last section on the last days, that chapter where you deal with Jesus's messianic consciousness, and that you're really pulling John into that, and that Jesus understood his identity and his fate as related to what happened with John. I thought that was really, it gave me a lot to think about. I'm wondering if it might be a little bit overstated, because then I was wondering, well, what do we do about Jesus now, in terms of his unique, distinctive contributions. So I would be interested in your comments about like where this leaves you in terms of your thinking about Jesus. And the other question that I prepared in advance has to do with given your active, rich imagination on these, which I'm saying is very positive. I really like that. I'm wondering what changed for you in your imaginings about John and Jesus and their relationship from when you began this project and then now at this point. What changed in how you picture them in your mind? So thank you again. I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm very glad to be here and to meet all of you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for this very, very useful and profound comments. And now, David, Jimmy, you will have a lot to answer. David.
Yes, thank you, Gabriele. Thank you to Gabriele and Josh Scott and the Enoch Seminar for inviting me to participate in this. It really is a joy. I consider James McGrath a mentor and dear friend in the Guild. And I've been talking with him about this John the Baptist project for many years now. My original PhD project back the late Larry Hurtado, I discussed possibly doing Elijah Christology stuff with Luke and John the Baptist many years ago, but instead went the Paul route. But this has still been on my back burner for a long time, so I have a lot to say. And I'm fascinated by James' work, and I'm so excited, like so many of us, to finally see these books out in the wild. This has been a long time coming, and it's been a joy to dig into them. Due to my own teaching and writing schedule. I have made it through the Christ Maker, but I'm still barely waded into the deep waters of this one. So my comments for this event obviously will be focused on Christ Maker. First, I want to say a deep thanks to James for this book, because there's a dire need, I think, to really radically reconsider John the Baptist, and I think this has been done in this book. And I just want to say about John's popular generic construal within Christian retellings of John the Baptist. I think the way that James has framed this book is really important, because he sort of goes right in the intro, addressing this issue, that John is no recluse. He is no street corner oddball that people might have been inclined to avoid. This is James' words, and I think aptly so. I agree. He is not. That John is actually someone that had the attention of almost all of the political and religious leaders in his day, and much of what follows with Jesus, his disciple, mirrors a lot of what is said already about the minimal evidence we have for John the Baptist and his life, and that is not a coincidence. James's exploration of this and teasing out of this very imaginatively at times, which I very much enjoyed. I think more could be said about this. But something, a profound historical entry point I found in this book that I think is important for every scholar of Jesus and the Gospels in particular to consider, that I think needs to be discussed further, should be obvious, but is not so obvious to many gospel scholars. And that is the reason why we know anything or aware about anything related to John the Baptist to begin with is filtered through the Jesus tradition that's preserved to us in texts by the early Christians. And so I'll use Christians in scare quotes, but the early Jesus movement, that is what preserves the tradition of John the Baptist. So I think unironically, it would be right to say then that it would be unimaginable, as James says, for us in our own lifetime to imagine John any other way than through the story of Jesus. But at a point James definitely makes in the intro and defends the rest of the book, is that it is equally unfathomable for most people alive today that when John and Jesus were contemporaries in their own day, Jesus was known through his association with John. That is how he became known. And that point alone just needs a pause, because that I think is a significant entry point into the discussion that should be taken very seriously, is that all of our information about Jesus would have been historically mediated after the John movement has already been well developed and spread much further than the fledgling Jesus movement that comes about afterwards, which begs for observation and begs for teasing out. And I think James has done that in a remarkable way. And so 2 points I want to focus on that being said, in my conversation about James' book. One is the chapter on someone is coming, on the relation of John and Jesus here, specifically with the Elijah figure. This is where I have the most interest here. Is one thing I would have liked to see more in this chapter is a deeper conversation about the Elijah tradition before it hits John, because I think it impacts a lot more about what James has already said about the relation between John and Jesus. So for example of this, James gives a conversation about sort of imagining the nature of baptism as John would have imagined it, and then the subsequent Jesus tradition following this. But he talks about, in this chapter, heavenly counterparts. And I found this fascinating because, and I believe he gets, and he cites Dale Allison on this, but Dale Allison has also made this observation that it's possible that Jewish ideas about heavenly counterparts may be in mind with John's actual baptismal ritual as well. And that talking about John's self-baptism and how he sees himself, I felt this was a very interesting way of framing John. Is that he'd already developed a conversation about John's self-perception, and I think it's bold of any scholar to try to write any book about the historical Jesus, much less the historical John, sort of two steps removed in the mediation here. But in his sort of imagining of John's personal sort of understanding of his own mission and identity, relating himself to Elijah in James's mind. Connecting this with the baptism and heavenly counterparts, I think, was very fascinating. Imagining that John would have self-baptized himself, and in this moment, what does he see happening? Is this where he really sees his identity coming to fruition, so to speak? Has he become Elijah in some sense in this moment? And this is very interesting that he connects this to heavenly counterparts, because he does mention briefly the Enochic tradition for the Enoch seminar. This is important to bring up. He does mention the Son of Man figure in Enoch and Enoch's relation to becoming this figure, because later Jewish tradition makes clear that he's associated even with Metatron, God's own personal assistant. And he says that he imagines that something like this can be happening with John the Baptist in relation with his baptism. And something I think that needs more discussion here, just in general. And I think you may take this up further in your book, in your wider scholarly treatment that unfortunately I haven't been able to dive into just yet. But this relation between becoming a divine being associated with baptism, I think, is very important. And it's underdeveloped in a lot of conversation on this topic. In particular, the clear evidence we have in the earliest reception of these stories that there is angelic identities being associated with John the Baptist from the earliest strata. I mean, I'm thinking immediately of Origen's commentary on the Gospel of John, where John the Baptist is clearly associated with an angel Israel, off out of the prayer of Joseph, that somehow he himself is an incarnate angel. And there's been, lots of work on this as well. I think also the ambiguity in early Christian reception, pre-Nicene formulations of what has now become a cottage industry, this early high Christology books. There's lots of conversations about the nature of the Holy Spirit and angel, and the sort of ambiguity between these figures in early Christian reception that comes from its Jewish apocalyptic forebears. But I think that more discussion on this related to baptism, especially John's baptism, is pretty important here. And so I love that James has brought this up, because we see in a lot of early Christian tradition that these categories of angel and spirit are already being conflated, and John's baptism may have been an angelic transformation in mind. And this is especially ripe when you start to make connections, as you have with later, earlier textually Pauline tradition, with baptism and the reception of the pneuma, pneumatic transformation into a pneumatic being and all of this, and seeing this etiology in Christ, of course, receiving the Spirit from heaven in baptism. But this comes from John. And I think I would have liked to see more talk on a possible polemic here against John, and this may be in your bigger book, so forgive me if it is, but a polemic against the John movement, perhaps, or at least pushing back against the John movement, perhaps, in the book of Acts, when the claim is made that Apollos, who only knows John's baptism, doesn't know anything about the Spirit. I find that fascinating, and find that almost ludicrous of a suggestion on Act's part that people associating with an eschatological baptism know nothing of the pneuma. You know, yes, I'm sure John's movement just knew nothing, and we were just waiting for the Jesus movement to tell us all we needed to know about the pneuma, right? So clearly, I think there's some polemical things going on there, but that's very interesting as it relates to John's baptism in particular. Was he baptizing with the Spirit and the Jesus movement claiming that it was just them? You know, and framing the memory of John as if John is saying, oh no, he will baptize with fire. I'm just with water. You know, I don't know anything about the Spirit. I'm little John. You know, it's like, come on, come on. So I think there's something there historically that I would like to see teased out a bit more. But one other point, my final point to bring up here is the death of John. I very much enjoyed his chapter on the last days on John the Baptist's death. But one thing I found missing in this chapter that I would have loved to see developed, and I did look in the index of the bigger book, and there's no sort of extended conversation about this, but I'm particularly interested in what James wants to do with Mark 9 after the transfiguration. You have a very interesting hapax there mentioned about the death of John the Baptist as the Elijah who is to come, which is clearly the issue. When they ask Jesus in the Markan rendition of this story, following the transfiguration, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And in the Markan Jesus's answer to this, he mentions that it was written of John the Baptist that his suffering would take place like this, and relates the Son of Man's suffering, presumably speaking about his own, to the martyrdom of John the Baptist. And what's fascinating in the reception of Mark, and I was first put onto this by Joan Taylor's book, The Immerser. Many years ago when I read that book, I was like just scrounging around in all the commentaries trying to find, does anyone have a good answer for this? Of the removal of that interesting hapax in Mark from Matthew, who keeps the post transfiguration scene in his gospel, although Luke removes the conversation altogether, interestingly, from this scene. But Matthew removes that language of it being written about John, because it seems as though it's very clear by the time of Matthew, he wants all the scriptures to only be referring to Jesus, right? About the things that happened to him. And so of the things that James just amazingly relates in Jesus's life to John the Baptist as coming from John the Baptist, I would have liked to see a more extended conversation about Jesus's death and the early Gospels' portrayals of the Passion, especially linking it to Isaiah. Because it is not until, because he does a wonderful job of linking John's own self-perception to the servant in Isaiah, which I have some thoughts about, but we'll save those. But in particular, the conversation of why leave out that the scriptures were referring to John's martyrdom, you know, when you get to the later Gospels, because it seems to be clear that the scriptures would be referring to Jesus at that point. And so are the Passion narratives themselves constructions of a post-Johannine Passion that already was using those texts to talk about John's own martyrdom and how they conceptualize John's martyrdom in their own movement, even to the point of attaching this to forgiveness of sins and atonement, so to speak, because as many scholars recognize what other texts are in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible would have been referred to that write about John's martyrdom. And by the time you get to the Gospel of Luke, and Luke has no problem, and James talks about this at length, with framing Jesus's entire ministry as a ministry of Elijah and Elisha after John the Baptist. Luke explicitly changes the Markan and Matthean framing of the passion from Zechariah to Isaiah 53 as the suffering servant, and even has in the crucifixion of Jesus the centurion saying he's the righteous one, from quoting from Isaiah 53. And so is that framing of the passion a post-Johannine invention, as Jesus as the Elijah who is to come? So these are some of the points that I would bring up for conversation today.
Thank you. Jim, it's your turn. You have many things to think about.
Yeah. Oh, this is just so wonderful and heartwarming. Thank you all for reading my book so closely, and for I've said more than once, but it's probably worth saying it here as well. I went into this fully aware that it was probably inevitable that I will be wrong about multiple things. And so I was much more concerned not to be boring and to try to actually, make some new suggestions and to dare to use my imagination. Sometimes, connecting dots in ways that are, at the very least unprecedented in terms of how people have tried to tell John's story. But I honestly think we do more of that and have done more of that in relation to the historical Jesus than we sometimes are even aware of now, because we've been doing some of those things, doing some of that dot connecting for so long. There are places where I think some readers have felt frustrated that I leave too many possibilities open, and then there are other places where I think readers have been frustrated that I come down here and maybe isn't this also a possibility? And I was often torn between wanting to leave as many options open as possible, to recognize that there are alternative ways of understanding the material, and yet also not just having the book be a list of options, right? And not have not fail to tell John's story. I mean, it seems to me that imagination is vibrantly at work in connection with John, but in ways that I think perpetuate a misunderstanding of him in certain key ways. And so I think the only way to push back against that is with some reimagining. One of the things I think is particularly challenging, right? I'm sure that Jesus and his movement bring us as close to the very early followers of John as we can get. The Mandaean sources, I think, do ultimately have a connection as well that reaches them via a different route. I don't think they borrow John from Christians or from anyone else, but they are further removed temporally. Josephus, we don't know where he got his information from, right? But it does seem to me that if he was connected with Bannus, that maybe there is actually some indirect, if not indeed direct, connection at one remove with John and his movement. But if there's anything to the connection between John and Gnosticism, the connection of John with Samaria and activity in places that were not Judea and not places that were sort of the heartland of Judaism in the strict sense, if there's anything that we can get from the divisions that we detect even within the Jesus movement, then John must have been the sort of person who brought people with diverse views together somehow around a shared vision. But also he must have created a coalition and a movement that probably from moment to moment was in danger of fracturing. And so when it comes to things like the question of whether John envisaged his baptism as an alternative to sacrifice, which should lead to complete abandonment of the temple, or whether he saw it as something complementary, like mostly focused on offering it to people who were not right there and able to easily go up to it. It's clear to me that the evidence can be understood in more than one way. And I tried to paint a coherent picture without trying to be overly coherent, right? And I know that sometimes I've received some pushback on whether, in entertaining the possibility that Mandaean baptism with its repeated character might have preserved something that was true of John's baptism. Some have suggested that it would be much more in keeping with John's eschatological urgency if this is a one-time only rite that can be performed. And I understand the rationale for that thinking, but I'm also aware that people are not always consistent, right? And that the way we create our rituals and formulate our things, trying to make room for inconsistency while realizing that the only way to connect some of these dots is to look for patterns and consistency. And so one of the things that the various panelists today have had me thinking about, is just, can we get a sense of the diversity of John's movement in a way that might help us figure out not just what goes back to John, but also where was Jesus innovating? Because I am very much persuaded that he was innovating. I mean, at the very least, when he teaches his disciples not to let people see that they're fasting, and gets a question about the apparent difference between his disciples not fasting, that's what it looks like to the observer, and John's disciples fasting. Clearly, Jesus is innovating there. I'm not sure it's a contradiction, but it certainly does seem to be an innovation. Was Jesus, in fact, pronouncing sins forgiven while merely sprinkling those who had mobility issues and not requiring immersion? And if so, would John have agreed, right? That's so hard to answer, not least because when we look at the Mandaean sources, one of the key things that they viewed John as having criticized Jesus for is baptism in cut-off water, and then also things like monasticism and the foregoing of having children and families and all this kind of thing, which seems to me to owe much more to what happens later in Christian history than to anything that would have been true of John and Jesus. And so it's so hard to see back past the disagreements of John's followers and offshoots to get at this. And so the question of whether John, to what extent John took aim at the temple, the fact that I was able to connect and I think make a plausible connection between Jesus' action in the temple and John's movement, and even if it's just the case that there's this continuity between Jesus and John, then that would probably be true anyway. But if there's an even more direct connection, then I think all the more so. I really feel like there's a question of nuance. There's a nuancing here that I still don't feel like I've entirely pinned down, and I'm hoping that I will continue to pursue some of these things, but also that others will come along and build on the foundation that I've tried to lay, while also probably tweaking some of the details. I say more than once in the big book that any of the chapters could have been a book of its own, and I did consider going that route at one point during my sabbatical as I was working on this. But I realized that nobody wants that sort of series yet. And so if this book opens up some avenues and other people come along and adjust and disagree, but also explore more fully some of these topics, I'll be happy. I do want to say, in relation to the temple question, that we do get in the Jesus movement and in the Mandaean sources an anti-temple streak that continues, right? And there's even an anti-sacrifice streak that is there in Jewish Christianity. And the question, I think the question we need to wrestle with, and it may be impossible to answer, but I hope I was at least tackling it head on and offering one plausible way of understanding the evidence, is that sometimes what happens as a movement develops is that someone comes along and dials back some of the radicalness of it, right? And whether that was Jesus doing that, was it Jesus' brother James doing that in that version of the movement? Who is, when does it get its most radical? Is it already there with John? One of the things that I hadn't noticed until working on this project and doing so at Magdalen College in Oxford, and the reason that drew something to my attention that I hadn't noticed before, was that I love the English choral tradition, and so went to chapel and heard the Magnificat over and over again. And I had not been struck previously by the tension between the emphasis in Luke's infancy narratives, right, in the Magnificat and also in the Benedictus, on what's happening as an expression of God's faithfulness to Abraham and his promises to Abraham. And yet, that's certainly a difference of emphasis from what we get in John's preaching when he says, yeah, descent from Abraham, yeah, good luck relying on that, right? And so even there, I think we may get glimpses of different strands of the Baptist movement, right? Some trying to dial back maybe a bit of John's radicalness. When it comes to some of the points that Federico made, I think that some of the points that he mentioned may actually, at the very least, be compatible with John having had at least a negative view of the temple, and may actually support it, right? The praise of the widow giving certainly has been viewed as not coincidentally found in close proximity to mention of those who devour widows' houses, and that there is in this giving, this praise of the widow also some critique of the fact that this poor widow who is to be praised for giving more. Nonetheless, you have this institution where she is giving her last two farthings, if I think one of the older translations has. Leave your temple, leave your sacrifice, leave your offering at the altar and go and make peace. I mean, that's so wildly unrealistic that some have viewed that as saying, yeah, the temple thing, go and make peace, right? This is, the temple thing is actually a subject of some criticism there, right? That actually what should be at the focus is the making of peace, the reconciliation, making amends. And so I don't want to say that Jesus or John was so radically anti-temple that they condemn people who offered sacrifice, as one strand of Jewish Christianity would ultimately articulate. I think they were simply saying, God's had enough of what this temple has become and is going to destroy it, and here's something else. And that may be a distinction without a difference, in the view of some, but I do think that there is an anti-temple streak that shows up enough across the tradition that we need to figure out how it gets there, and at the very least what it owes to John, even if it's not fully in articulation of John's own view. Let's see what else came up. I would love to do for David's, and then I'll get to Lynn's because there's something I really want to dig into there. But in fact, both of these probably together are other examples of books that I hope either I will write eventually or somebody else will. The reason I was moving to possibly talk about David's first is that I do think it might be of interest to me to do a book exploring what did Jesus understand about his death and how does it relate to sort of John the Baptist, right? In fact, I think that came up in both of your comments, right? The possibility that something like the parable of the tenants, killing the son, was that Jesus talking about John, when he first uttered that, how John had been killed, and is it that, one of the reasons why Jesus' followers had such resources to be able to make sense of his death, after the fact that on the one hand Jesus had expected that suffering was in store for him because it had happened to John, and that Jesus had said things about what had happened to John that could be applied to him, right, after the crucifixion. And so that's something that I definitely hope others will explore. I'm certainly interested in exploring. Another subject that would make a great book is just doing this sort of triangulating back from the diversity of baptisms, right? Mandaean, but also the diverse Christian baptisms in Western and Eastern Christianity. Sometimes unusual ritual elements show up in one particular area and not in another. And sometimes that's because they've innovated, but sometimes it's because they've kept something that others have let go by the wayside. And so there have been there have been numerous studies of baptism, but I don't know if there's any that has tried to just do a compendium of all the different ritual elements and explore whether those things that are common across the whole tradition are most likely to go back to the very beginning. But then also, where are there individual elements that show up here or there that might be preservations of things that are ancient, or at least have emerged out of things that are ancient? I certainly do think that for John's immersion given the widespread practice of immersion for so many different reasons and with so many different significances in this time, would have needed words, would have needed elements of ritual besides the immersion itself to lend it weight and give it persuasive power. Just as slaughtering an animal can be just a barbecue, right? Even though you do have the centralization of sacrifice, but the possibility of having an animal slaughtered and it not be a sacrifice is at least entertained within the context of Judaism at the very least. It took a particular setting and particular words and other things to give that action the significance of this is a sacrifice offered to God. And I think the same would have needed to be true for baptism. And so I'm not sure what else to say about any of those things. I think that'll get the sort of conversation part started at the very least.
Yes, I think is the opportunity to open up a conversation. Al Baumgarten, I see, had wanted to say things, but he had to leave a presentation. He wrote some comments in the chat, and of course, the figure of if I can add something to the conversation, I mean, I think that the figure of John the Baptist is certainly very complex and deserves also a very careful discussion. No, I mean, exactly as the historical Jesus. I think it should be important to consider is that, of course, we have historical John the Baptist, we have historical Jesus, and then we have the view of Jesus by his first disciples. There are three different things, no? And then we have to consider also another important thing. We don't know the kind of questions that John wanted to answer. Because I don't think that everything can be resolved simply in biographical terms. Of course, if John is, I mean, we are saying that Jesus was a disciple of John, okay, whose disciple was John? Because he must have been disciple of somebody else. So to a certain, because nobody is coming from nothing, okay? Which means that is coming from some open question. For me, for instance, as a specialist in Second Temple Judaism, the most important thing is not only to go backwards from later sources to find a sort of original nucleus. For me, it's very important also to start from what are the questions that were open at the time that made the answer of John important. So, for instance, I think that is more likely that the idea that the emphasis on forgiveness of sins came by the apocalyptic urgency of the end, more than simply by the presentation of a more convenient way of forgiveness of sins. There must be a reason why this problem has become so important. And so I think that any discussion on the historical Jesus, on the historical John the Baptist, should also start from a discussion about what were the questions that were open at the time of John the Baptist, and then John the Baptist tried to answer, and then Jesus tried to answer, and then the followers of Jesus, because we see a continuity, certainly, but also in a process of development in which each voice is adding something new in the moment in which each protagonist is trying to give an answer to some open question. Of course, every answer provokes new questions and the need for new answers. Okay, I don't know if I've tried to. So for me, it's important to read also the historical John the Baptist within Second Temple Judaism, and probably because from the sources, many different interpretations are possible. In order to narrow these possibilities, we have only the possibility of understanding whether the dynamics and the questions that were open at the time of John the Baptist. I don't expect immediate answer because it is a very complicated problem, but I see that Cecilia Vassen will also like to ask a question. We can promote two panelists. Cecilia, are you with us?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you all for a very stimulating conversation. I read both books very carefully. So I was on the book review panel at the SBL, where we were 5 or 6 reviewers, and we also had a very engaging conversation about James's books. I wanted to draw the attention to the infancy narratives. I hear a lot about historical imagination, and I get a bit worried that we lose track on what kind of principles are we using when we are doing historical reconstructions, if we can use our imagination, well, to what extent, sort of. And when it comes to the infancy narratives, James said that Jesus scholars are also using their imaginations. Yeah, well, to some extent, everybody have to sort of try to understand what was going on, but we certainly don't use the infancy narratives as historical resources, which you do, which I would like to hear your response about, because somehow you use the angelic message concerning the prohibition against wine and strong drink, that it somehow reflects John's mother's vow about her son, and then that leads to conflict with his father, and also an anti-temple. Well, he can't work as a priest because of this vow that his mother made, and I find that whole argumentation very speculative. And as Federico brought up, there is no trace of an anti-temple message by John. And Jewish prayers at this time, they also included forgiveness, asking for forgiveness of sins. So it wouldn't have to be a conflict. You could get forgiveness in different ways. And also, as Federico also brought up, Josephus is very positive about John. Would he really have been that positive if he was known to be anti-temple, anti-sacrifices, and offering an alternative to, in conflict with the temple, a means of forgiveness and so on. So yeah, so how do you use the infancy narratives as a historical sources? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's a great question. And I realized that was the one thing that came up in at least the first two. I think David was the only one who didn't mention that. And so was glad that we were brought back to that. I didn't start by finding some things in the infancy stories and then following them through and trying to find them in John's adult life. I started with the question of what it would mean for someone who was the son of a priest to offer forgiveness of sins through another means than temple sacrifice, which seems like at the very least it could compete with that line of work. And if that's the right way of understanding it, then what I had at that early point in my thinking about this was that, wow, there has to be an interesting family backstory to that. I wish I knew what it was. Too bad I probably never will. And it was just in working on the the question of reconstruction of what story, if we could determine it, that the Baptist group was telling about John at some early stage, that I noticed the connection between the hair as a point of contradiction between Nazarites and priests, which I didn't see anybody commenting on that, presumably because you don't get this lifelong Nazarite vow associated with a character who's a priest. And I immediately had qualms about focusing on such details in an infancy story. But what I realized is that both John's lineage and whether he appeared to be a Nazarite were the kinds of things that would be visible and knowable about John as an adult, right? And the fact that they are woven into an infancy story, I think the only question is not, is this infancy story true, like a historical document, but is it weaving in information that was preserved about John at this point, right? Just as we might ask about the names of his parents, probably would have been known, and so would have been incorporated. And so what I'm really asking is, if Luke included these things that would have implications for what John looked like and who John was known to be, would Luke have done that if those details were at odds with John as he was known as an adult? And so it was that sort of reasoning that made me feel that this was worth exploring. I realize that it is connecting dots that are, rather diverse and doing so in an imaginative way. All I'll say about that is that it seemed to me to provide a possible answer to the question of, how does somebody who's the son of a priest end up doing this thing, right? And my point, just to address Federico's point from earlier in his presentation, is not that we don't see John in the temple, which has a natural explanation, the fact that priests spent very little time serving in the temple. And so it's that he seems to be offering something that at the very least is providing what the temple claims to through an alternative means. And it's the fact that these details are embedded in storytelling about John and seem to make sense of, or provide one way of making sense of who John showed himself to be, that I thought it was worth exploring this. I was expecting the criticism. I'm expecting there to be some skepticism about this. And I will not say, oh, I'm sure I've got John right on this point. But as this had not been explored to my knowledge and seemed to connect a number of facets of the early storytelling about John, it seemed worth putting in print and seeing what people made of it.
Jim, if I may add a quick question. I mean, among the things that makes Jesus different from John, you do not mention, at least I've noticed, a strong emphasis on the fact that apparently John was not believed to be a miracle worker or a healer. No, I don't know. While we have this emphasis, now, of course, there are different interpretations. Some say, okay, the emphasis on Jesus as the miracle worker and the healer comes from the later Christian tradition, is not from Jesus. Or this could be simply something that makes a difference in the way in which Jesus and John was interpreted. So what do you make of the fact that apparently we don't have any emphasis on, because of course, there are many people that say also that the fact that Jesus was believed to be a miracle worker was something that strengthened the idea that of the association between healing and forgiveness of sins, and so the idea of the authority of Jesus of forgiving sins. And by the way, I still see a certain kind of difference between claiming that a baptism is for forgiveness of sins and claiming instead to have the authority, to have been given by God the authority to forgive sins, as at least the disciples of Jesus later will claim about Jesus. I don't know what you make of this problem.
Yes, as I said, it seems to me entirely possible that when Jesus reassured someone that their sins were forgiven, that baptism was simply assumed to be part of what happened on that occasion, given Jesus' association with John's movement. But that's, a point of silence. And so it may well be that Jesus was taking what John had done and moving in a different direction. The fact that the Jesus movement is a baptizing movement and continuing, according to Acts, to be proclaiming a baptism for the forgiveness of sins makes me more inclined to see continuity here. But again, there's some uncertainty. And there was another point you asked. What would you ask about before that? I wanted to come back to the
fact that John
miracles, yes.
Miracles.
So on the one hand, I mean, the Gospel of John saying, John did no miracle may be like, Acts saying, John's followers haven't even heard that there is a Holy Spirit. It seems, like it may be more polemic than reality. I'm very struck by the fact that when Jesus sort of takes the reins of this movement and is going about and is gaining a reputation as a healer and exorcist, as well as proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching, that Herod Antipas hears about what Jesus is doing and thinks John is back. And that suggests that what Jesus was doing was what he associated with John and his movement. Of course, the question still has to be asked, were these things associated with John and his movement because John himself did them, or because people like Jesus who were in John's movement did them and so were associated with John? In other words, is this, John getting credit for something that it had been Jesus doing all along, sort of as part of his movement? And there too, I don't feel like I can come down strongly one way or the other, but it does seem to me that if there is anything, not necessarily, preserving what Herod Antipas actually said, but something that seemed historically plausible about him having said that, then I would want to say that such things were part of John's movement and were being experienced by people. And that too, I think, is something that deserves more attention: the connection between baptism, exorcism, healing, and so on.
We have 10 minutes, and I would like to hear something more about the three panelists. If they can briefly, in a few minutes, in 2 or 3 minutes, if you want to add something to as your reaction to the discussion that we had and what Jim said. Federico, want to be the first one?
Okay. Well, of course, the discussion was fantastic, very interesting, but time is brief, so I just would like to ask James a question about which I'm very, very curious, and because I'm still reasoning on your fascinating solution to the Son of Man problem. And so, with regard to your thesis that Jesus identified with the one to come announced by John, as also Dale Allison maintained, the coming one who would immerse the world in a fiery spirit, I would like to ask, how do you explain Jesus' saying in Luke 12, 49, 50, so I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled, and I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is accomplished. In the first part of this double saying, Jesus seemed indeed to identify himself with the coming one. But this doesn't fit very well the second part, for how can it be that the baptizer in fire should be subjected to his own eschatological baptism? I would like to know what is your opinion on that. Thank you.
Jim.
That's a fantastic question. And I'm pretty sure you asked it not expecting I will have a clear answer to it that will nicely wrap up all the loose ends. On the other hand, I think that, one thing that I really would like to spend more time exploring is indications of how Jesus' own perception both of what was to unfold and his role in it may have changed between when he sort of starts out as part of John's movement and then John is imprisoned and he steps into the role of sort of regrouping the movement to John being executed and understanding his own destiny to be to follow a similar path. The possibility that Jesus may have actually laid the groundwork for what people like Paul would later say, that he sort of bears the curse, that the judgment, that Jesus by dying actually takes the punishment that was set to fall and sort of takes it upon himself. If it weren't for works like the Testament of Moses and things like that, that also seem to envisage the possibility that somebody might, by being willing to suffer obediently to God, might sort of turn back God's wrath or bring about the arrival of the decisive intervention of God. I would be as skeptical as I was earlier in my academic career. Now I'm starting to wonder, if we need to revisit, not because we're entirely wrong, but because Jesus may have taken some steps in the direction of what the church later then elaborated on, which seems, unless one's going to posit a miracle, then something in what Jesus had said and done that allowed a messianic movement to think that this crucified man could nonetheless be the Messiah probably needs to be there. And so the question of change in sort of Jesus' outlook is one that I actually made notes about as we were thinking about some of these other points where we're trying to pin down, how did Jesus relate to John? Where was he innovative? Where were he and John on the same page, but others after them sort of domesticated them both or made them more radical? And the way we see diversity over not just things to do with the temple, but also even Jesus' statements about Samaritans, right, seem to be different. This foreigner, at one point, and yet the Samaritans can be understood as anything but foreigners, right, from another perspective. And so, but in terms of that, I mean, it does seem to me that Jesus, how should I put this? The question from John the Baptist, via his followers, even if that's not, historically sent by John, and of course, if it's from Q, that's not placed in the context of John's imprisonment. But it seems to me that it poses a question about Jesus that Jesus probably would have asked himself, which is, is he continuing John's work, and the coming one and the one who's going to bring about judgment is someone else who's going to come later? Or is he continuing John's work because John's chance to continue proclaiming the message and calling people to repentance was cut short, but he will eventually also be the one to carry out the judgment? And there are enough sayings, including Son of Man sayings, that are associated with final judgment. There are the things that seem less likely to have been invented, such as the promise that you'll sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, which would have included Judas if uttered by the historical Jesus. That, in fact, Jesus envisages that time coming. I don't know. I wish I knew, and may have to try and turn my historical imagination, for better or worse, to the subject. But how did Jesus envisage this unfolding? Right? It seems to me that one of two things, when we put those sayings together with like that, what looks like a Nazirite vow that Jesus himself makes at the Last Supper, right? That either Jesus envisages that he's going to die, and then at some point later the kingdom will dawn, and that's when he will drink of the fruit of the vine again with his followers, or he's envisaging that his willingness to lay his life down and get to that point will lead God to intervene, because God might be able to accept the death of one of his messiahs, the priestly one, but not the royal one as well. And exactly how Jesus envisaged that unfolding, I don't know, because so much of that is overlaid with the church's theology and perspectives of hindsight. But it seems to me, in light of John's death, that there are things that Jesus might have thought about that previously I would have assumed were just the church's theology written later from the perspective of what actually happened, some of which might actually at least have echoes of Jesus' own reflections on that subject. Does that get at least some of those things you're wondering about?
Thanks.
Federico?
Sorry.
If it answered your question.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
No, I'm okay. Thank you.
David, I know that you like to add something, and then I would like also to hear very briefly from Lynn too, a final comment or question.
Yeah, thank you.
David.
Yeah, James, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. So James, you talking about his bringing up his death again, and kind of responded to my question there. I'm curious about the resurrection as well, though, because I feel like you didn't push that far enough. I know I heard at SBL you got some pushback about just how much tradition of Jesus and his life and death and all of this is coming from the John the Baptist tradition. But I want to say go much further, because I'm curious about what you would say about the tradition about John's resurrection. I mean, it's clear by the time of the Gospels give us this. They betray that, at least according to them, whether it's their construction or not, is part of this question. They at least say, when trying to identify who Jesus is, which is the scene previous to this in Mark, right? The confession, they think he's John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the prophets come back, but explicitly, and I can't remember right off the top of my head whether it's Matthew or Luke or both. I think it's Matthew, but that says a prophet raised from the dead, right? Or John the Baptist raised from the dead, right? So there's clearly traditions of John's, it seems to me, of John the Baptist's resurrection before Jesus. And could that also be a source of the narrative of Jesus's own?
Before giving to Jim, to you the final word, Lynn, do you have anything to add? Just a brief comment on another question.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how this book was so provocative in like putting John and Jesus together in my head in a way that they just hadn't been in a dynamic before, and that quite that way so strongly. And it makes me wonder about what you just said a little bit earlier about the interactions and relationship between John the Baptist. I am still like really intrigued by that, and your discussion about the rival traditions that we have about John and Jesus. And you make a point, I think toward the end, about it seems like the tradition is trying to make one more humble than the other. Like there's a competition about who is the most humble. So I'm just wondering, like, I just would welcome any other comments about the way you have those two in your head right now, as in a mentor relationship and a rival relationship. Like, what can it possibly look like?
Jim.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with that point, and then hopefully come back to David's. If everybody has patience for just another moment or two. I think that John and Jesus, the relationship was one of mentors, and of course, if we've had a good mentor relationship, then it becomes a friendship and one of collaboration, and I think that is entirely feasible in that context as well. I think that the rivalry owes much more to the fights over the legacy of John, and also the fact that Jesus, having been crucified, presumably persuaded some of John's followers that, oh, we thought he might be the one, but clearly he wasn't, and so we need to look for someone else to come. And I think there's room for, and I seem to recall somebody doing an analogy in a paper at, I think it was the Bridge New Testament conference, and looking at sort of the Johannine epistles and what happens to that movement, and like comparing it to like the history of Methodism. It's like what happens when you have a start of a movement that then becomes a breakaway, and then it fragments further, and the next generation, things like that. And we've had discussions of that and explorations of that, in connection with the Jesus movement and the sort of Torah observant, Jerusalem mission, and Paul's proclamation of the Gentiles, and his distinctive teaching, or maybe it wasn't all that distinctive about, but he becomes at the very least part of a movement and the voice of a movement that's saying you can become part of this without being circumcised. And we haven't talked about it as, that as part of the longer story of the Baptist movement, right? With this as just one part of it potentially, and perhaps Gnosticism and the Dustan sect in Samaria who prays standing in water, and other things that might be somehow related to this. So I think that John and Jesus were largely on the same page. I think that Jesus, when he innovated, was at least seeking to be true to John and his message, and that most of the sense of rivalry comes from the competition among followers of Jesus and other followers of John who did not become followers of Jesus. In response to David, I just want to point out that I think one thing that's really intriguing and also deserves some more attention, right? The only real exploration of the Book of Revelation connection with sort of John the Baptist is J. Messingbird Ford's suggestion that maybe John was the author, which obviously is problematic and not going to persuade that many people, but that there's a connection with John's movement in its Jesus-related form, at least in its in the form in which we now have it, which may have been redacted from an earlier version. But we have these two lampstands, right, that are the two anointed ones, right, from Zechariah, right, the two witnesses, right, who are said to be identified with those figures, and so are presumably the priestly and royal Messiah, right? And who could that be in this context if not John and Jesus, right? I don't see other plausible candidates, and both of them are killed in the city. Both are raised from the dead, and there's clearly a connection with the Baptist tradition here, because the flight of the woman who's to give birth to the child also seems to be part of an iteration of the same tradition that we get at the end of the Proto-Evangelium of James, where Elizabeth flees with John into the wilderness. And so I think that there, in particular, in the Book of Revelation, there might be some indication of thinking about John and Jesus raised from the dead that deserves further exploration. My hope is that, if nothing else, I have given a whole another generation of would-be PhD students a whole range of possible thesis topics to explore. If I've only done that, then I've done something useful for the academy. So
yeah, you certainly did, Jim. I mean, if the value of a scholarly work is just to raise questions, to generate questions, I think you succeeded, David. And certainly from this meeting comes the idea there is a lot more to know, and also a lot more to reconcile also many aspects of this figure, of the figure of John the Baptist, that we may be in contradiction, or probably they are not, and can be reconciled probably in a better understanding of this figure. So I want to thank you very, very much for this opportunity that you are given to all of us to talk about John the Baptist again, and I assure that we will not be the last time that we are talking of John the Baptist, because certainly there is much more to say, also based on the new books, of the new articles and works that have been published recently. I would like to thank our three panelists, David, Lynn, Federico, for your wonderful comments and questions. I would like to thank Cecilia, Al Baumgarten, all the people that have contributed to the chat and to the live discussion that we had also on the chat. I would like to thank Joshua for his work preparing the conference and assisting us in this event. So thank you so much again for your contribution. Our next event, I would like to remind to all of you, is on January 7. Maybe, I don't know if Joshua, you can put the link. Joshua 7, we have a one-day conference on reading the New Testament within Judaism, with an outstanding list of panelists. We will have an entire day devoted to this topic, discussing the theoretical foundations of the within Judaism perspective and the implications for the study of New Testament and Second Temple Judaism. It will be a big event and will be followed then in June, in early June, by a 3 days of conference on the subject. So this will be a sort of prologue preparing us for the conference, the June conference. I invite all of you to join us for this important event and to continue attending the meetings and the initiative of the Enoch Seminar. Thank you to all.